For this weekend's shipwreck video, we return once more to the waters of Ironbottom Sound. Because, yes, there's still more stuff to cover from the Nautilus Survey. This time around, we'll be looking at another ship that I've covered before, USS Laffey, the less famous counterpart to the museum ship still around today. First found by Ballard in 1992. Then surveyed again by Petrel in late 2018, and recently covered a third time by Nautilus in July of 2025. Her wreck is one of the more interesting ones out there, largely due to the sheer devastation of the wreck, in large part down to how she sank, which was violent to say the least. That said, since I've covered Laffey twice, the ship herself, and her wreck, I won't spend much time on the sinking here. This came on November 13th, 1942, in the general chaos of the naval battle of Guadalcanal. Laffey would be in the thick of that from the start. Unfortunately for her, that left Laffey exposed. While sources will differ on exactly what happened, the ship would be shot to ribbons, with her stern blown clean off from both a torpedo and secondary explosions. With Laffey slipping beneath the waves, taking 59 of her crew with her, the captain, William Hank, included. If you want a further indication of how hectic that fight was, Laffey had 188 survivors. Of those, 116 were wounded to varying degrees. The battered condition of the wreck should, as such, not be terribly surprising. As noted, this wreck was first located by Robert Ballard in 1992, at a depth of around 800 meters or 2,600 feet, where she was found resting upright, though missing most of her stern. Now, there's not much material out there on Ballard's visit to Laffey. As such, this video will focus on the Nautilus Survey in July 2025, with material from Petrel Survey to compare against as well. Let's start with the weaponry, as is tradition, though there's not a lot to note here because, well, half of that is gone. That said, the bow mounts are both in place, still turned out to port where they last engaged the Japanese. Because of that, and the fact we start this look on the starboard side, we'll be looking at the rear first. Though this first image, by virtue of being a high angle, does show the barrel. There's no apparent damage to this mount either. The lack of damage continues when you move further to the bow. There's no shell holes of note, and while certainly rusty, no major pieces have fallen off the number 2 gun. Even this opening in the side here is just the doorway inside. The base of the mount as well is also pretty intact. Now the number 1 mount, that one has issues. The entire back plate is falling away. With how it's bowed out here, it looks like an internal explosion knocked it loose. Not enough to blow it off completely, but it's definitely not pretty. And it's a stark contrast to the number 2 gun when we move back to that. The ladder is still there, as is the doorway, partially open, likely where the crew jumped free to abandon ship. That this hasn't fallen away is a bit impressive. The rest of the mount, meanwhile, is completely covered in various corals. Laffey's relatively shallow depth contributing to that marine growth. That coral continues on the number 1 gun, though as noted, this one is more damaged. The back plate hanging on for dear life. Something even more apparent from this angle where we see more of it. We also have this bit of metal on the back here. That's remained in place despite the back plate falling away. The bowing out of the metal is also easier to make out to the side, reinforcing the idea that this was an explosion inside the gun mount. Though I should note that isn't a given, and it might be something else entirely. The mount beyond this is largely undamaged. Although when you move further to the bow, it becomes apparent that this is the only damage of note. The side of the mount is fine, or at least it doesn't show any signs of major impact. Not from the back, and not from further ahead here. The deck shows more actual damage, but we'll be returning to that later. For now, let's jump over to the port side, where the number 1 gun still shows no notable damage. The gun barrel is flat and trained out at a long-gone enemy, and the face of the mount shows no shell impact, something that holds true for both sides, though the barrel and mount have, if anything, even more coral here. Ditto the deck, which for its part doesn't show damage this far back from the bow. Unfortunately, this is also the last good look at the number 1 gun. We don't see the other side of the mount. There could be a shell impact there, but I can't say for sure. The number 2 gun, meanwhile, still shows no damage whatsoever. Even up here, there's nothing of note. That's almost surprising with how much of a pounding Laffey took, though good for the gun crew. And it also gives us a good look at the top of the mount as a result, including where the barrel would elevate. There's not a lot more to touch on here. We get some good looks at the side of the mount and closer in here, which is good for looking at this particular type of 5-inch mount. But there's no damage and no real defining features either. Not until we get to the back and see that opening inside. So I'll wrap up the main battery here with a look at the top of the mount. Then move on to the 20mm guns, which have not fared nearly as well. Not that this is surprising when you take into account how rusty the rest of the ship is. We see one of those guns from the side here, which also gives a good look at the bridge that we'll be looking at in detail later. As for the gun, it's pointing up with the gun shield intact and in place, though it's too dark to make out much more. Not that there's much to make out. A closer in look, in addition to showing the interior of the bridge, just shows a rusty mess. The identifying features of this gun are lost to time. Even the barrel is completely coated in coral. A look from the front isn't much better in this regard. It even looks like the other gun here is flat out gone. Looks like that, as we'll also see later. First, however, let's shift to the Petrel Survey. We have another 20mm gun here, closer to the stern. As I noted in my previous video, this is probably a gun on the surface here. On the bottom, it's fallen down where the stern broke, while another gun nearby remained upright, if completely unrecognizable beneath all of the coral. As for the bow pair, here's a different angle, which shows that this gun is in fact still there, just angled forward, in the same position it had been when Petrel looked, with much the same coral coverage, albeit it was more vibrant back then. This is also where we'll wrap up the guns and move to the torpedoes, though more like the torpedo tubes, I should say. We don't see any actual torpedoes, probably. The first look at these comes from the bow, where the deck has collapsed pretty badly just ahead of the tubes. There's a lot of damage to Laffey in the amidships portion of the ship. You can faintly see even more just to the side, though that's not much more visible from further out, though we do see more collapsed metal behind the tubes. Although the tubes themselves have held up pretty well, they're all here and intact, largely recognizable too, even if we can't see beneath them to make out torpedoes. Laffey was said to fire off her torpedoes. However, with the tubes fixed firmly on the center line, we can't say that for sure. Either those reports are false, or she fired and rotated the tubes back before sinking. We can't know for sure without seeing the torpedoes one way or another. That aside, when looked at from above, well, the tubes continue to impress. There's very little damage here. Certainly better than Udachi or Teruzuki in this regard, both from the stern and from the bow here, or here for that matter from closer in. Again, you can't quite make out if there are torpedoes in there. I don't think there are. They should be at least faintly visible, but who knows for sure. All we can say is that the tubes themselves are there. The torpedoes will remain a mystery. Just having an intact set of tubes, as we're seeing in this set of images, is nice enough. Especially this final shot from directly behind, which shows that massive gash in the deck behind them. These will probably fall through the deck relatively soon in the grand scheme of things. Regardless, that brings us to the end of the torpedoes, and the weaponry for that matter. Let's shift to the bridge now. In stark contrast to the Quincy survey, Nautilus put a lot of focus on the bridge, so there's a good bit to work through here. Starting from the side here, Laffey's bridge is an interesting one since she's a Benson-class destroyer, an older generation than our surviving museums, with a different style of bridge. On Laffey, the rounded shape is very clear, largely due to the bridge wings being a skeletal framework. The thinner steel has largely rusted out, though interestingly, not much change from Petrel. As you can see here, details are the same. The bridge wing here, and the bit on the bridge itself here. That similarity will continue a bit later. For now, let's move down a bit further. While the bridge itself is mostly fine, the area ahead of it is not. Very rusted through here, with only frames remaining. Something that impacts the bridge as well towards the stern. We didn't get a good look at this area from Petrel, so I can't say for certain how much worse it actually is. But in the Nautilus survey, it's not pretty. Both the tower here and the rusted through bridge wing here, which doesn't look much better from further out either. Not that this is surprising. It's some of the thinnest metal on the entire ship. The thicker metal of the bridge tower itself is better preserved lower down. There's a bit rusted through past the portholes here, but the rest is more or less fine. The higher level is similarly intact, including the base of the fire control director, which we'll be turning to later. For now, let's move closer in on the bridge proper. A look inside the bridge itself. We can't make out much other than the porthole and the coral, and the interior is completely covered in silt and fallen debris. But when you change the angle by a little bit, well, you can see the engine telegraph here, fallen over at some point after the sinking, but remarkably intact, even if we can't make out whatever the final setting was. This was visible during the Petrel survey as well. It wasn't any clearer back then, though the metal around it wasn't quite so bad. It seems a lot of the debris has rusted over the years. However, despite this, the telegraph continues to endure. And if this is made of brass, it'll last longer than a lot of things on this wreck. Though, with that last look, let's move on. A final brief glance at the starboard side from above, where we can see the engine telegraph here, and the deck rusting through just ahead of it, which means that's falling down sometime soonish. There's other areas rusting through as well, here and here. And of course, there's also that rusted through area from earlier toward the gun mounts. Whatever metal used to be here is long gone, even though the railing has endured right next to it. An interesting comparison, though also the end of this section. Now we'll go back to the bridge from the front. This is another good look at the 20mm guns and at the front of the bridge itself, where the portholes are quite clear even underneath all of the coral, while the lower level is showing more signs of deteriorating over the years. Something apparent even during the Petrel Survey, bouncing back to this picture. However, in spite of that damage, the rest of the bridge is pretty well preserved. It's here where that Benson roundness really shines through, even if the bit above that is basically gone like the bridge wings, leaving just the framework of the railing and the base of the fire control director. As for the port side, this continues the general theme. The lower level is rusted out, though it's even more apparent here, mostly because you have an entrance here, serving to show the difference between entrance and rusted through. And even the bottom of the bridge tower itself is missing a lot of steel. The bridge proper is still mostly fine, including another look inside, though this time mostly blocked by fallen debris. A lot of metal has fallen down from the upper level, looking at things from above, and that continues as you move further to the stern, with the railing also twisted up and pushed in. That said, this is only true of the upper level. Further down, there's less debris. The middle level is pretty much clear, though there's not much other than a porthole, while that rusted lower level continues surprisingly far back here. And that's also where we wrap up the side of the bridge. Now for the back, where a couple interesting things jump out. The mast is one here, or what's left of it anyway, with a sealed entrance here as well, while this loose metal further down might be what's left of a funnel. Meanwhile, when moving a bit further up, two other things come into frame. The upper level of the mast is one, as well as this piece of debris to the side, which is probably the rest of the mast. It's the only thing that would make sense with that shape so high up on the ship. Regardless of what the debris is, it's where we'll wrap things up. The last image of the bridge is this one from the front, mostly useful to give a nice look at how the front of Laffey's bridge looks. Much may be missing, but in the end, it's still there, still standing proud where so many other wrecks lost theirs. Something that also applies to the fire control director above it. As noted, we've seen the base of this before, poking up from the top of the bridge. There wasn't any damage to the base that we could see, and this further applies to the director itself. It's completely intact, including the rangefinder poking from the sides, which is interesting actually, because when I did the video on Petrel Survey, I could have sworn there was a shell hole here. As it turns out, that was just a trick of the light. Even from closer in, a lack of damage continues to stand out. All of the siding equipment is still there and undamaged, with Nautilus giving some excellent zoomed-in shots here, and here where even the glass is still in place. While not quite as close in as that, the side shots are also interesting. The ladders on the side are still there, leading up to where the fire control radar would have been. None of that is left other than the mounting point. But coupled with the rangefinder here, it makes for an interesting look. Something more visible from higher up in this picture. While the next image for its part shows how this is also trained out to port, where it was left providing targeting information to the main battery guns, and incidentally exposing the back of the director, where some actual damage can be found, though this seems to just be from rusting, not from shell hits. Similar damage can be seen on the side here, just above the rangefinder, with this one actually looking like a small shell hole. It's tough to be sure, but that's what it looks like, at least to my eye. Either way, it's also where we can wrap up the director and move to the amidships part of Laffey's wreck. We've seen some of this with the torpedo tubes earlier. This section of the video will focus more on the hull, starting here where it collapsed behind the tubes. This is likely from the explosion that blew the ship's stern off, especially when you look at this scattered debris here blown onto the deck, clogging and covering the entrance into the ship. Well, an entrance. We have another one further along, which shows its collapsed door here. Not much else, but that damage is interesting in its own right, as is the relatively intact deck above it with the torpedo tubes. Something that isn't the case further ahead, where we shift back to more debris. This is probably what's left of the forward funnel. Emphasis on what's left. There's not really much to say about it other than being a pile of wreckage. However, further down, we have one of the most interesting pieces of debris. This here, which is roughly the shape of a torpedo. Now, I'm not saying it is a torpedo. It could just be a random bit of debris. There's no real identifying features either way. Still, if this is a torpedo, it would lend credence to the idea that Laffey didn't get off her torpedoes. Regardless, the area ahead of this doesn't need much more focus. It's just a mess of various pieces of debris, something that applies to the starboard side of the wreck here as well. Admittedly, we can see a bit of wreckage punching through the deck ahead of the torpedo tubes, but not much beyond that. I'd say the more interesting bit is here, where we have a much clearer entrance to the ship. We still can't make out much, but if you're one of my sharper-eyed viewers, maybe you can pick something out. By all means, put it in the comments. In any event, as we move further toward the stern, other details come into focus. The most noteworthy of which is what seems to be a 14-inch shell impact here. We know Laffey was hit by at least one of those shells, and this would seem to be it. Although it has rusted out in comparison to when Petrel took a look, particularly toward the top. That theme continues a bit further along. We have this bundle of line here. It's fallen over to rest on the deck beneath a 20mm gun, with that rope being particularly fascinating for a couple reasons. The preservation is one, of course, especially in light of the rest of this ship. But the other reason is, well, here. The Petrel Survey had that still standing upright and level. It's fallen over in the intervening years, as has the metal here and here. This is one of the clearest areas where Laffey has fallen apart over the last 6 or so years. The final two pictures of the Midships area, for their parts, are nowhere near as bad. We can even see better inside this entrance, though again, not much is recognizable. In any event, that wraps things up here. Now for the bow. Man, this is going to be a long video. But I digress. Laffey's bow has remained more or less the same since Petrel took their look. These two images are a good comparison. The coral is slightly different, but the bow hasn't changed at all. It's still knifing out of the darkness, looking more or less intact. Until, of course, you move to the side. We have the anchor here, but just beyond that, holes that have rusted through the thin plating. These holes are seen in better detail here. Interesting, mostly for what they show on the inside. Collapsed metal frames of some description. Nautilus speculated that this was either a shower area or staterooms. Either way, it's quite distinctive, especially when you zoom in closer in the next couple pictures. Unfortunately, beyond this area, things get worse for poor Laffey. Her bow has completely collapsed just ahead of the number 1 gun. It falls away, likely from impact with the bottom. This could have popped off the back plate of gun 1 if it wasn't an explosion that did it. It certainly crumpled Laffey's deck, and stands in stark contrast to the front of the bow, which is more or less fine by comparison, either from the front or from the side. The deck in this part is about as good as you could expect, ignoring this gash here, which is from a shell of some description. The hull is less pretty for its part. It certainly imploded toward the bottom. That accordion style of crumpling is quite distinctive. Laffey went down fast, and this makes that quite clear, with it extending as far back as the buckled deck here, something that stretches from port to starboard. Even from above, you can tell where the deck just falls away. Though ahead of that break, there's nowhere near as much damage, especially when you look at the bow coming out of the darkness to round off this section. So, with all of that in mind, let's finish this surprisingly meaty video with the stern. Here we have a stark sign of that destruction. The deck plating peeled up and thrown away from where Laffey blew apart. In both the Nautilus and Petrel surveys, this damage is very clear. It hasn't changed much, if at all, but it doesn't really need to. It kind of speaks for itself. That said, there's not much to note other than that bent steel. Here we just have ruined metal where Laffey broke, and it's much the same here or here. Impressive damage, yes, but that's about it. It's not until you go lower where the hull vanishes that things get interesting again. Not so much for the missing side, though the sheer devastation is noteworthy. It's much more damage than Teruzuki suffered. But what that damage exposes is the truly interesting part. Laffey's power plant, from the bent shaft here to the turbines here, which are particularly fascinating because you don't see something like this. The power plant is normally hidden deep inside the wreck, and on Laffey we get to see it from above and from the side, even if it's mostly buried in a combination of mud and marine growth. We also see some more equipment from the front here, and from above here. Which brings us at last to the end of this lengthy look at Laffey's wreck, with one final set of images to end where I also ended the previous video on Laffey's wreck. Her builder's plate preserved on the bottom. It was hard to make out in Petrel's look, and it's not much clearer now. Despite that, it seems a fitting place to end. A reminder of the men who built Laffey, as well as those who lived and died aboard the ship. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.